we're looking at software that is currently closed that we want to open source that will make a big difference in certain communities that we already play in. That's like a big part. So we call that sort of our strategic code contributions kind of path. We also are looking at places where we can go in and make a difference that are, I'll call them net new.
Hi, this is your Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Let's Talk. Today we have with us Randy Bias, Vice President of Open Source Strategy and Technology at Mirantis. Randy, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure to host your, we have known each other for a very long time, the open source community. I remember it was very early days when we met at the Open Stack Summit. So I would like to know a bit about your career before we talk about Mirantis, before we talk about Mirantis's, more aggressive open source strategy. So let's start with you.
I started in Silicon Valley when I was 19 years old in 1990, and I was a systems administrator. Then later became a network engineer and did backbone engineering in the early 90s. Then did information security for a bunch of years. Then went off to Asia to build data centers in 2000, 2001. And all of that culminated in me being one of the first people to adopt cloud. So in 2006, I started working on my first startup, which was an open source startup using Puppet and a bunch of other tools to basically allow you to create an in-tier web application and deploy it on the system nobody had heard of called Amazon Web Services Elastic Compute Cloud, which at that time was in private beta. So I've always been kind of early to the punch, and that all morphed into, over time, my attempt at a second startup, which was building a product around OpenStack called Cloud Scaling. And our product, Open Cloud System, was relatively successful. We had some great customers, AT&T and Walmart, to name a couple. And that really sort of began my love affair with open source. I was one of the early directors, the initial inaugural directors for the OpenStack Foundation. And cloud scaling was an open source business, and I just really enjoyed the people, the community, and what I learned there. And that's really morphed into me being an open source leader at EMC, helping them release some of their first open source products, and then again at Juniper Networks, where I led the open sourcing of Open Contrail, renaming it Tungsten Fabric, putting it in the Linux Foundation. And then here I am now at Mirantis.
If you look at those early days, and if you look at now, a lot of water has been under the bridge, but how do you look at open source today? Is it the same open source? Because now it's a lot of commercialization, which is a good thing for the sustainability of open source. But from your perspective, how you have seen open source has changed, if it has changed?
It's really interesting from my perspective. I started off using Unix and the internet in the 1980s, before anybody my age was really using it. And then I saw Linux come along and really kind of clean the clock of all the early Unix makers. And that was when I really started to understand that, in a way, the ultimate commoditization of anything is through open source, right? Once software matures, its natural progression is towards open source, because there's a public commons, and that ability to have everybody contributing and partaking in the community is what creates more aggregate value for everybody. I remember in the early 1990s, I think it was my first or second job, what happened, this is a great story, what happened is Sun decided to stop shipping their C compiler with their operating system. And so there was a company that went around and said, hey, we will port the GNU C compiler to Solaris so that your business can use it if you contribute back a certain amount of money for us. And they went around the valley and they got all those contributions. They did that work. And then suddenly everybody was using the GNU C compiler on SunOS and Solaris from then on out.
Now let's talk about Mirantis. What attracted you towards Mirantis, looking at their own heavy contribution to open source and your own, play in the open source world?
So Mirantis and I have a very long history. One of the first times that Mirantis ever engaged with OpenStack was as a subcontractor from my company, Cloud Scaling, in 2010. And they helped us build one of the earliest OpenStack deployments for internet. And we had a really interesting relationship from then on out. Myself and the co-founders, we worked together, we competed against each other in the OpenStack space. And, recently Mirantis has had a change of leadership back to one of the original co-founders, Alex Friedland. And when I was talking to Alex about potential opportunities at Mirantis, it was clear that some things had changed, and Mirantis had kind of moved away from where they were in the early days, where they were a heavy upstream contributor, and they were seeing a lot of customers come inbound to them and find them because of the noise and the things that they were doing, the contributions they were making in the community, and they needed to get back to that. And so I found that to be a really interesting challenge. I love the vision of being a pure play open source player. I love the fact that they've done so much around OpenStack and Kubernetes. And, there's a whole bunch of sort of rising tide coming now with AI and ML, with all the stuff happening around Broadcom and VMware. And so there's a ton of opportunities. And, I've always enjoyed these guys. So I just decided to join the team and see what I can do to help kind of level them up from an open source perspective.
I do remember Mirantis used to call themselves pure play open stack player, but you just said, it's good to see them as pure play open source player as well. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so we see ourselves as an open source infrastructure company. Our focus is on open source, really at the infrastructure layer, virtual machines, containers. We're also looking at things like supporting people with their AI, ML pipelines. And so when we think about ourselves as being a pure play open source company, we think about ourselves as somebody who unlocks customers and allows customers to have leverage against their traditional vendors. Because in the past, what's happened is you've got proprietary systems, whether it's software or hardware, and you kind of get really locked into those systems. And what's happened is that more recently, that started to even happen with open source players. You kind of get locked into an open source player in their ecosystem, and we think the power should be in the hands of the customer. So we want to provide 100% open source solutions for our customers so that they have the power and they have the control over their future.
I love that you said that, because sometimes we feel that moving to open source means breaking the vendor lock in, but the fact is you can get logged into even by using open source. So can you talk a bit about what kind of approach Mirantis is taking, so that once again customers have the freedom and flexibility, that just because they're using open source doesn't mean that they are not logged into a specific vendor?
Yeah, so I like to try to avoid talking about lock-in, because I think sometimes it gets to be sort of too binary. I like to think about it as being risk reduction or reducing the cost of making a change from one vendor to another, right? And in the past, whether it's proprietary or whether it's open source, a lot of the vendors basically set it up so it's very difficult for you to leave them. And we have a vision of getting to a place, and it's still a journey for us, to allow our customers to have more and more choice, and to be there as glue in the middle to help them enable and make that choice. So whether they want to adopt public cloud, whether they want to go to private cloud, whether they want to use proprietary software or open source software, we're there to enable them for that, using our own open source solutions.
Now let's talk about, of course, Mirantis has been doing open source from its early days, but now they are officially launching open source program office. And of course, you are also here as open source strategy. Talk about the need, you did touch upon that earlier, but the need for Mirantis to kind of become more aggressive with your open strategy. Why now? And what more we can expect from Mirantis, especially after you joining the company?
Kind of in the early days, when I was first spending a lot of time with the Mirantis team competing against them, they were very much an upstream first open source contributor. They were one of the top contributors in OpenStack, and they've sort of drifted away from that in the last 3 to 4 years, and we want to get back to that. And so that's really my primary remit, to basically help coach the team, to build up some of my own team, to get out there, to drive thought leadership in these communities, to help increase the pace of innovation in these communities, to turn us into a much better open source citizen than we are. We're still a great open source citizen. It really depends on where you're looking at our lines of business. Some of our lines of business, some of our products like K0s and Cosmotron, they're all open source first. Others, we've drifted a little bit further away from that. So it's really about getting us back to our roots and how we did things before, and just rebuilding that culture as we move forward.
And you folks are also launching the open source program office. What would be the role of open source program office at a company like Mirantis?
Yeah, so if you think of me as being sort of the open source coach for the business, you can think of the open source program office as being the rest of the bench. right? So there will be a whole bunch of people on the team in different kinds of roles, whether it's project or community manager, technical writer, DevOps QA, software developer, so that we can go in and really help out. So the way that I see it is that it's not a one size fits all. When we go in and we look at how we want to help a community, we're going to evaluate what that community needs, how we can help them, how we can make a difference. And that might be to get in and help with the build and test system, right? It might be to go and update the documentation and make sure that it's better. It might be to go in and lend resources to coach other people in that ecosystem, or to coach people on our own team about how to be better in terms of their upstream contributions. It might be increasing test coverage. Whatever it is, we want to go do the dirty work. Like if you go and you look at I watch a lot of NBA basketball, but there's this notion of sort of these role players who kind of do all the dirty work that the superstars don't do. And I think that that's really our role, to go in there, to do the dirty work, to basically be the glue pieces that help our own business be better as an open source citizen, and to help level up the communities that we play in for everybody there to be a better citizen as well.
When we look at open source program office, does it have a set rule, a specific rule, irrespective of what kind of company we're talking about, or the role itself changes? Is it about internal engagement? Is it about external engagement with open source projects, open source communities, or open source foundations? And how are you looking at you did touch upon that, but there are two aspects of open source, internal, external.
Yeah, I think every OSPO is different, and it depends on what the business needs, right? Some businesses have a high level of maturity around open source, some have less, and it really, for me, just stepping back from open source for a second, as a guy who prides himself on being very strategic, I am not really about pattern matching and then trying to, run playbooks that I've seen run by myself or others in the past. I'm about coming in, doing the critical analysis, understanding what's going on, what needs to happen to create success, to, really define what that success is, and then to go set up a specific plan that solves for that. And that's what I think our role is. And, and I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of months since I come on board to really talking to all the product managers, the development team leads, the executives, and trying to really think through and craft a detailed strategy that thinks about all the aspects of the business.
What are the other activities the community or ecosystem can expect from Mirantis after this aggressive moves towards, becoming a even better open source citizen?
We are in a spot where we know that there is certain kinds of code that we have kept downstream that we want to start putting upstream. So we're looking at stuff we're looking at code, we're looking at software that is currently closed that we want to open source, that will make a big difference in certain communities that we already play in. That's like a big part. So we call that sort of our strategic code contributions kind of path. We also are looking at places where we can go in and make a difference that are, I'll call them net new. So some examples of that might be Kubeflow. So we see that people are using Kubeflow a lot to basically manage their ML training, inference, and fine-tuning pipelines. And doing that on top of Kubernetes makes tons of sense. We're a Kubernetes company. We're looking at going into Kubeflow and, contributing back there, seeing what we can do to make that community better. We're looking at Cluster API, which is inside the Kubernetes ecosystem, which is another place where we think we can play and make a difference. And so, excuse me. So we're really looking at ways that we can go out and, very strategically make a difference for both ourselves and for the communities that we play in.
When it comes to open source, we are seeing some trends which may be seen as just sputtering, but if you look at the longer picture, bigger picture, these things happen and community comes and fixes it. Good example is, HashiCorp, and then, Terraform, OpenTofu came, Redis Labs, Welky came. We sometimes think that if we put a project within a neutral foundation, then suddenly it will have a lot of diverse players and it will sustain the project. But you gave example of like Tungsten, where even part of Linux Foundation, a player pulled out. So can you also talk about sustainability of open source, whether it's within a company or in a foundation? What is the right approach so that projects don't die?
I like to think that open source never truly dies. It just evolves into a new state. But of course, it's not true. Some small projects do sort of fade away. But the reality is that a foundation is not a community, and a community does not create a foundation, right? Community is something really above and beyond any foundation that you're under, any license that you're using. Communities exist even for closed source, right? But when it comes to open source, there's a unique way that communities exist, which is in conjunction with these open source licenses. So when a foundation walks away, like Linux Foundation, or when a company walks away, like Juniper Networks, something like Tungsten Fabric can still stay alive as OpenSDM. If a startup, creates an awesome project like Terraform or Redis, and then they decide to, close source it or at least move away from a true open source license, then the community can take it and fork it and run with it. And we're seeing that happen a lot more. And I think part of the problem is that sometimes companies look at open source as a business model or as something that gives them a competitive edge. And to a certain degree, competitive edge is true, but that's not all it is, right? If you don't really think about the community first, you can get in trouble. I remember in the early days, before OpenStack, there was a company called Cloud.com. They had a product called CloudStack. It was all closed source. We were using it to build the first public cloud in Korea for Korea Telecom. And then OpenStack came along. And, it had a community that was thriving. Cloud.com responded by open sourcing. They didn't have a community in place. They didn't have a way to push back commits. They didn't have a way to file bugs and tickets. And they were really caught really from behind because they had an open source license, but they didn't have the infrastructure. They didn't have the momentum. And this is OpenStack before there was an OpenStack Foundation. There was just a will. There were a lot of people who wanted to see an open source cloud infrastructure project who are willing to put in time, effort, energy, and really do the community right from scratch. And so it took off like a rocket ship, and kind of left projects like CloudStack behind.
The code is the last part. Community is the most important part. As you give a great example, without community, just releasing your code. And yes, open source is not a business model. It's a collaborative model. It can be code development, but it's more about people and very little about code, because code is the easiest part. Dealing with people is the most complicated part. So thanks for bringing that point as well. When we look at these trends like HashiCorp or Redis, are you worried about them? Or you're actually like, hey, this is what happens. You're actually happy the way community quickly responded and came up with the alternatives, because customers, the community, certainly left that community high and dry, which has invested a lot in that. They had alternatives immediately. So what are your overall thoughts on some of these developments?
I mean, you're right. You have to be thinking about community first. Also, I think people need to take a good long look in the mirror before they go the open source route. Like it seems like a shiny bauble, like it'll solve certain kinds of problems. But if you don't think you're really going to build a community, if you think it's going to be a community of one, why are you open source, right? That doesn't make any sense. And you can always shift from proprietary to open source if your processes and the way that you're doing things internally are in sort of that open source model. You always have the chance to, to downshift if it makes sense. It's just that open source is not like a business strategy. It's a methodology. It's an ideology for many. It's a way of thinking about, how you want to solve problems kind of in the open as a public commons. And if you don't have those kinds of intentions, I don't just think you're going to struggle, right? You're not going to prioritize the right things. And you see this also in terms of how it's consumed a lot of the time. Large enterprises want to consume open source and they think it's free, right? Or they think that they don't need to provide resources. They'll just go out, they use the free software and everything will be copacetic. But the reality is that, it has a cost. It has a cost to use. It has a cost to consume it. So it's not a panacea, but it absolutely has a place. As I said, it seems like most software tends over time to basically commoditize into open source, just because when it does that, it sort of becomes part of the common good. And like I said earlier in the interview, if that move hadn't been made by Sun to remove their C compiler from Solaris and SunOS, the GNU C compiler might not have become kind of the compiler, de facto, at that time across multiple operating systems. And if that hadn't happened, I don't know where we would have gotten to at this point, because right now the GNU C compiler is still pretty much the de facto compiler across all operating systems except for Windows.
Randy, thank you so much for joining me today, and not only talk about your own career, but also Mirantis' approach to open source. Thanks for sharing all of those great insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.